Delmarva Today with Don Rush.
We live in a country that is getting more diverse with each passing year. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. In recent years, the country has been struggling with an era where its demographics are changing, and finding solutions to a future has often brought conflict and harsh political rhetoric. Minal Bopaiah has written a new book entitled Equity: How to Design Organizations Where Everyone Thrives. And we were on the phone this morning. Welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me, Don.
So what did you come across that inspired you to write this book? And particularly, you make a distinction between equity and equality.
Yeah. I think it's just my ability to sort of see the system and wanting to find a way to communicate that to other people who I feel a lot of us were raised to be system blind in a way, to not be able to see it. And so I talk about how equality is giving everybody the same thing, whereas equity is about giving people what they need according to their differences so that we have equal access to opportunity.
So one of the things you point to in terms of invisibility is racism. Explain a bit about that and how that works.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big topic.
Well, it'll take a few minutes.
Yeah, in soundbite language,
right.
How I would explain this is that when our country was founded, there were explicit laws that said that Native Americans, or people who are indigenous to this country, were racialized, were categorized in a subtractive manner, meaning there was these weird laws about blood quantum levels, that you had to be 1/2, 1/4, 1/16 Native American or part of a tribe in order to be considered an indigenous person, which meant that entitled you to social services that were written down in Article 1 of the Constitution. Article 1 of the Constitution says that the United States will provide social services in perpetuity to the indigenous people of this land. And by saying that you could only be indigenous if at least 1/16 of your bloodline was Native American was a way to disseminate the Native American population. On the flip side, however, Black people were racialized expansively, meaning that there were laws that said that if you had a drop of Negro blood in you, you were considered Negro. What that meant is that slaveholders could enslave their children under the basis of those racialized laws, instead of the fact that if you have intergenerational slavery, it's likely that more than 1/16 of them have, enough blood of people of what we call the white race in them, and yet they could not escape slavery because there was only one drop of Negro blood that qualified them to be enslaved. And so that is how the system has made invisible the ways in which we have racialized people, none of which is based on science, and we fail to see the repercussions of those laws today, even though it's very clear that people have disparate outcomes based on the ways in which we have been conditioned to racialize them.
What do you say to people who suggest that the way to get rid of these divisions is simply not to recognize them in the first place?
Yeah, that's a little bit like saying that if you have a broken leg and you just shake it off, it'll be fine. It's like, Fred Rogers, in the movie about Fred Rogers, A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, there's this beautiful line: anything mentionable is manageable. If we can talk about it, we stand a chance of healing it and eventually maybe moving past it, but not until we can actually talk about it fluently. Ignoring it is not going to make it go away.
Because one of the things that struck me is that, particularly, I happen to be white and male, for that matter, and the thing that strikes me is that because I live in this particular world, I don't really think about race very much, except when I encounter someone else who, say, maybe African American or Hispanic or what have you. And it seems even then that there's an invisibility, to use your word, to what how other people may see the same situations. Go into that a bit. I mean, because W.E.B. Du Bois talked about the color line, right, that separates whites and blacks. And one of the things that's always struck me is that, for white folks, that line seems to be pretty dim. They don't really see a whole lot. But for African Americans, for example, that line is very bright because they do see the impact that actions which white people may seem, say, benign, nonetheless are adverse to them.
Yeah. I want to be clear that I am of South Asian descent, so I don't want to speak like an authority on the black experience. What I will say, however, is that it's not that the question is, why don't white people talk about race? Because technically they have it. And it's kind of interesting how it's evolved. Like the Irish and the Italians were not considered white until there was enough civil unrest where they realized, if we allow them to be considered white, we could still continue to oppress black people. Right?
Right.
So in the book, I use a tool called the group identity wheel that really gets people to chart all of the dimensions of their identity: race, gender, socioeconomic status, religion, ability, physical or mental, sexuality. And in doing that, what we really need to do is be able to understand each of us in that sort of complexity. Because, as a white male, you don't have to think about it because the system is set up for your comfort. Just like, even though I'm a woman of color, I'm not physically disabled and I'm heterosexual, and the system is set up for my comfort as a physically able and a heterosexual person, right? So we all have ways in which the system is supporting us, and most of us have at least one way in which the system is marginalizing us or oppressing us. And so diversity, equity, inclusion is about all of that. It's about being able to talk about that in terms of racial dynamics, but also in terms of other dimensions of our identity, and really looking at how the system is either supporting the experiences that are innate to those identities, or that we are socialized to treat people with those identities, and how it is not.
How do you assess this idea that there are many, certainly white men, but certain whites in general, particularly white men, feel as if somehow they are under attack because there is this expanding, changing, obviously, demographic? I ran across actually a Facebook post the other day which talked about the disappearance of white people in television and television ads, for example, which I found actually odd. I mean, there is a sense of being under siege by these people. How do you bridge that?
Yeah. Diversity, equity, and inclusion benefits everyone. So it is about changing the system. It's not about attacking any one group. However, if you're in a group that has been privileged, then justice can feel like oppression, right? Because to say that there's an absence, that there's like this vanishing of white people in ads, is to ignore the fundamental question that needs to come before that. Is our media representative of our population and of the world? White people are actually a minority globally. Black and brown people are the global majority, and our media does not reflect that. So what is it about the experience of being white that leads you to think that you have the right to occupy all the space? And that if you're not occupying all of the space, somehow that is an injustice towards you. Instead of being able to share the space appropriate to the demographics of the actual world. Right? Mm-hmm. What is it that leads you to think that you have that right? And what leads you to think for you to have that right is not actually even your fault. It's how you were socialized to believe. Right? So somebody committed an injustice in how they educated you. An entire system tried to get you to believe that you were in Santa Claus, and now you're finding out that Santa Claus doesn't exist. And you're getting mad at the people who are telling you that Santa Claus doesn't exist instead of the people who tried to get you to believe it in the first place. So your anger is misdirected because fundamentally white supremacy only really benefits the uppermost, most rich white men. The rest of the white population, whether that's white women or whether that's middle-class white people or poor white people, it does not benefit them. White people vote against their best interest in order to align themselves with whiteness instead of saying, oh, if I actually were allowed to see myself as on par with black people or Mexican people or immigrants, then I would actually align with what they're fighting for because that would benefit me as well. But I'm being gaslit into believing that I should feel superior based on my whiteness and my maleness instead of my common humanity.
Is there an element of not being at the bottom that is traditionally, for instance, in Jim Crow, one of the things in the South was that you may be on the bottom as a poor white person, but you weren't completely on the bottom, and it did give you some kind of authority. Do you think that, I mean, or has that disappeared with Jim Crow? I mean, that was a major element in terms of the population.
I still think that that's true. My very good friend Jonathan Metzl wrote a book called Dying of Whiteness that talks about this, how it starts with the story of a white man who has some sort of cancer and votes against universal health care because he doesn't want Mexicans and welfare moms to get it, even though he could benefit from it. He's too poor to afford health care and dies as a result of not having health care, but didn't want to vote for universal health care because he has been made to fear the other so deeply.
In terms of this idea of rugged individualism, which seems to permeate us, I mean, certainly I grew up in a situation where you took responsibility for yourself and your success is yours, even if you, for instance, recognized that you had some privilege, whether it was being white or male. How has that influenced, you think, how we think of ourselves in terms of other groups?
Yeah, I mean, I think rugged individualism is the most toxic myth we have circulating in our society today, and it really gets in the way of us doing things that are good for humanity. You know, I heard a wonderful analogy once, like, you know, what if we all got into heaven as a group? Like, it was all or nothing. Like, either all of us as a human race were admitted or none of us, right? Like, as if it's not a competition then between individuals. And so it's, you know, the rugged individualism is toxic because it's simply not true that it's not even about privilege. It's about how did the system support you. So, for example, I'm not white and male, so that's not the type of privilege that I have. However, I wrote a book this past year during the pandemic. I was able to write a book because, one, I'm child-free, which means that I don't have children that I had to take care of or homeschool during the pandemic. And two, I'm married to an incredibly supportive man who is a firefighter and paramedic and who also does all of the housework around the house. And that was what gave me the time and the mental space to write this book. Now, other women don't have that. And so we need to be able to talk about our successes in a way that gives credit to the people and the structures around us and not buy into this. And that doesn't mean that I didn't work really hard, right? But it wasn't just my hard work that led to my success. It was my hard work plus having an incredibly supportive spouse and not being a parent and not having to engage with childcare responsibilities in a system that's not set up for it.
That leads me into a quote from your book, which I believe is that other countries have social safety nets. The U.S. has women. That really struck me. Talk a little bit about that, because it seemed to be very succinct in terms of who the caregivers are here.
Yeah, that was a headline, actually, during the pandemic. And, yeah, I mean, so many women have dropped out of the workforce because of the pandemic, because they had to take care of their kids. Now, why haven't as many men dropped out? Why is it assumed women will? I mean, when I tell the story about my husband doing all the housework, people are like, oh, you're so lucky. And I was like, yeah, but that shouldn't have to be the case. Like, first of all, I shouldn't have to get married in order to write a book. Those are not related skills.
Well, I guess not. Well, I don't know. Go ahead, though.
You know? And, like, two, why should it be based on, like, the luck of how good a guy is that my career success is dependent on that? Right? So if we're really talking about being rugged individualists, then create a system where it's not dependent on me having to have a supportive spouse to do well. And in actually the article to read in like sort of together with that other article about how women are the social safety net, is a Harvard Business Review article about giving women advice that if you're ambitious in your career, your best bet is either to marry a super supportive spouse of either gender or not get married at all. Getting married to a lukewarm supportive spouse will kill your career. And so we need to start asking ourselves these questions, right? Like, why is it an assumption that women are going to take over caretaking responsibility? Why is it that we do not compensate for what equates to about 20 extra hours of labor for women each week, and there is zero compensation tied to it?
How does this fit into the changing role of women? I mean, obviously, in the 1950s, obviously, they were taking care of a home, and actually duties in the house, which were quickly automated, didn't take you, for instance, all day to do the laundry anymore, right? There are all these things in which left a lot of women actually feeling empty. And I think Betty Friedan talks about the problem with no name, as it were. And as you move forward in the 1960s and 70s and so on, you see that women are beginning to break into the workplace. We see now, I'm also, I think 50% at least, as in some of the colleges and universities. Mm-hmm. What does that say in terms of the relationship between men and women and the role that women play beyond just simply being caregivers?
Yeah, I mean, so my parents came from India. In India, women actually, there's a higher percentage of women in the STEM fields than there is in America. And it's a very patriarchal society, but my mother was a doctor just like my father. The thing is my mother was a doctor, and then she came home and had to get dinner, ready. Right. And had to do a lot of other things that my father didn't do at first, and eventually he evolved, like hopefully most men do. Right. And so, and also we need to acknowledge that life is infinitely more complex and challenging than it was in the 1950s for everyone, even for that Lever to Beaver scenario. And that scenario wasn't even really, that was the schema we had in our brain, but that was not the reality for the majority of Americans. We are not taking into account single-parent homes. We are not taking into account that now parents have to teach their kids about how to survive active shooter drills. They have to teach their kids about how they're going to talk to them about drugs. They're going to have to teach their kids about the dangers of internet pornography and the ways in which children are getting baited. Those things did not exist in the 1950s. So the amount of cognitive and emotional labor in the home has also increased significantly, much more than in proportion to whatever got automated in terms of laundry and dishes. Right.
Well, let me ask you this, because you also make a reference to unethical patterns and talk about algorithms. And one of the things that struck me, by the way, if we sort of move towards the Facebook, is that one of the things I became actually recently aware of is that Facebook not just simply provides a connection between people, but it also begins to shape who we connect with, because it obviously then offers either other friends and people who are involved, say, and are what we think as a particular interest in politics. You can start out watching about say Fox News and then find yourself reading about QAnon because of the shape of that algorithm. What about those unethical patterns and those algorithms that seem to be invisible but nonetheless shape how we see the world?
Yeah, I mean, I spend some time talking about that in the book because really that's getting at the system, right? Are we making it easier for people to embrace difference and to be inclusive and equitable and mitigate our biases? Or are we actually making it easier for people to be afraid of differences, to be exclusionary, and to give in to our baser biases? And technology has a huge role to play, and it's profoundly unethical when we design systems that do the latter instead of the former.
You talk about this idea, and there's another phrase that comes to me, which is if bias is a thumbprint of culture on the brain, then media are the ink pad. What do you mean by that? And I mean, how do we break out of some of the invisible restraints, I guess, that we have. We just mentioned a moment ago.
Yeah. So the first half of that statement is from Mahzarin Banaji, who was one of the original scientists who discovered implicit bias. And she refers to bias as the thumbprint of culture on your brain. It's how you've been socialized to think about the world, right? The world is not exactly how we think it is. It's been designed a certain way, and then we're socialized to think that that design is normal and natural. But then I say that media are the ink pad, because the thing that is imprinting that thumbprint on your brain is often media. Media is the first place for many of us that we learn about people who are different from us, people outside our family, people who are of different races or cultures or sexual orientations. And the way in which media either reinforces or subverts stereotypes plays a big role in what we think about other groups. And often we are not aware, we do a lot of work. My company, Brevity and Wit, does a lot of work with media companies. And often media professionals are not aware of the full power of media. There's a lot of talk about freedom of the press, but there hasn't been a measurement of the impact of the press. So what do I mean by that? For example, like, Osama bin Laden is never referred to as a terrorist in the New York Times. He has always been referred to as the suspected mastermind of the September 11th attacks. That's legally accurate. However, the impact is different than the legal technicality. The human brain condenses that into Osama bin Laden as a terrorist, and he's responsible for 9/11. The human brain doesn't make the calculation that, there's been no court of law that has tried him. That's not how the human brain works. And so media needs to start measuring what is the gap between the intent of the words that you say and the actual impact on audiences. What is the audience's takeaway from the content that you are delivering? That is, I think, the next evolution of media. And you may not be able to mitigate all of it, but that is the sort of information that needs to be fed back into the media ecosystem so that it can continue to evolve in a way that actually benefits humanity instead of driving more division and going for eyeballs instead of going for comprehension.
Of course, there's an extension to that, which is, for instance, we talk about traditional media, which certainly was around actually during the time of the Constitution, which is like the press, for example. And we had a sort of limited issue with, say, electronic media, but that was always something that was licensed, that had some control over. Now we're talking about a media or social media that no one seems to control, but there's an awful lot of people who put in this kind of input and the subtleties, and sometimes not so subtle, about other people. How do we overcome that one? Because and I think that it really intrudes not only in society at large, but certainly even into the workplace itself.
I mean, we need to have real conversations about the power of these platforms and what we as a society want to nurture. The tech company, to die on this hill of free speech is a little bit complicated because it really does seem to center the comfort of white men who are not really at risk of being targeted. And so what I mean by that is when I first joined one of the social media platforms that's for professionals, I was getting messaged by somebody who was making me really uncomfortable. And I tried to report them to the platform. And their response was, and this is in the early days, well, you can either get off the platform or you have to be completely public and expose yourself to that. And this happens with women journalists a lot, right? They are harassed on Twitter and send death threats and rape threats. Men are far less likely to get that. And so when you're talking about free speech, it's well, if you're not ever exposed to that sort of threat, you don't know how scary that is. And why isn't the tech platform protecting that person? Why is it only protecting the white man's right to free speech and not the woman of color's right to walk down the street or exist in the public sphere safely? That should be as precious a value as freedom of speech, that any individual should be able to walk down the street or exist in a public space without having their life or their bodily integrity threatened. Right? So we have to have a conversation as a society of like, what are our actual values here? Are we saying that freedom needs to come at the expense of bodily safety for women? Because it doesn't come at the expense of like bodily safety for men in that way, you know? And so like people have to understand that like if you have a certain identity, your experiences are different. And so therefore, how can we create this so that it actually values everybody's bodily integrity and right to exist in safety and the right to say what you want to say without being threatened with death or rape?
As a matter of fact, yeah. As a matter of fact, I'm reminded, actually, there's a book I recently published called Sidelined about women in sports broadcasting and the kinds of things, the comments they get and harassment they get online, and not only are threatening, but also highly, obviously, sexualized as well. So, I mean, it certainly is out there. The other issue I wanted to ask you about was the concept of cancel culture. What about that, and how does that intrude into, say, a work environment?
Yeah, so cancel culture is a little bit of a double-edged sword. And I always ask people, first define what you mean by cancel culture. Right? Like, I mean, and I'm like, I don't know if you have a definition, Don, but...
I get a sense it's been going on for a long time. It's just more efficient now, but go ahead.
Yeah, well, so what I define as cancel culture is when people in power abuse their power and cause harm, and there is no mechanism that forces them to take accountability for it. Cancel culture is consumers and individuals saying, we are going to hold you accountable because nothing else is. Right? So if we think of men in entertainment, and I'm not talking about Harvey Weinstein, who was eventually actually tried, but other men who it has been known that they have sexually harassed, if not assaulted, women or other individuals in their workplaces, in the media, right? But yet there was nobody present. There were no charges brought. They were not ever really held accountable for their actions in any legal way. They made no amends to their victims. And so cancel culture is saying you don't have the right to be on the airwaves then. I am not going to watch this show if you are going to allow that man to act with impunity. Right? That is different than what I think is people. There are other people who seem to think cancel culture is like you say anything that upsets me, and therefore I'm not gonna engage with you. Now that's not what cancel culture is. That's just being fundamentally ridiculous.
I mean, I think because one of the things that strikes me is that when you're shooting down as opposed to going after somebody who's in power, is that there are people who can say things or put something on their website, and for whatever reason, then other people begin to pick this up and act against them, criticize them, perhaps even try to ruin their reputation, as an example. And I think that's one of the things that takes place on the bottom end of it, as opposed to, say, somebody who certainly is a celebrity, for instance, and is a public figure, right? I mean, there's a bottom thing as well, I guess.
Yeah, and so the more appropriate response with somebody who has less power is if they started a blog and said something, is to actually, I love the word by Loretta, I think her name's Loretta Ross, she's a Smith professor, call them in and try to hold them accountable by saying, are you aware that your words have this impact on either me or people of this certain identity? And allow them the time to respond, right? Allow them the time to grow and to think about it and to respond appropriately. And then that person needs to make actual amends for it. They need to repair whatever harm that they may have done, right? That's a healthier way for us as citizens to engage with one another in society. To not do that, to just attack somebody who has a blog and start a viral campaign to shut them down is not actually cancel culture. That's public shaming, which America has a long history of doing. We kind of love doing it. We've, ever since public hangings, public shaming has been our tool. But that's a tool of punishment. That is not a tool of accountability. Accountability is having difficult conversations and giving people the opportunity to grow and to make amends. Now, if somebody doesn't want to grow and make amends, then further accountability might be some form of you are not allowed to then partake in this part of society or this industry, right? Like, so for example, the whole Amy Cooper story, the woman who called the cops and said that an African-American man was threatening her in Central Park, calling hysterical when it was just a guy watching birds who asked her to put her dog on a leash. Chris Cooper, who was the African-American man who was the target of that racism, was really kind of willing to just hold her accountable and call her in and said that he doesn't think that she should be like publicly shamed for this, but that this behavior was inappropriate. And that would have been an opportunity for Amy Cooper to do some reflection and try to make some repairs. Instead, she's now she's filed a lawsuit against her former employer who fired her for doing that. So she hasn't actually made any repairs, and she's continuing to just hold herself as like some sort of innocent victim in this encounter, which she is not. She is not admitting to her responsibility as to what happened, right? And so she's not taking accountability, and now people are like, well, she shouldn't be employed. I would be like, yeah, until she's willing to take accountability for her actions, she probably shouldn't be employed by a company, because she's clearly willing to do harm and not try to make amends for it.
We've been speaking with Minal Bopaiah. She has written a new book entitled Equity, How to Design Organizations Where Everyone Thrives, and a fascinating conversation, and we appreciate you taking the time to talk with us this morning.
Thank you so much, Don. I had a great time.
This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening. Delmarva Today with Don Rush.